My perspective is going to be, counter to Andrew's is the, I think, growingly unpopular human rights perspective. We find that international development is being reshaped due to global economic changes, changing priorities of government. But what we see is also a worrying trend, which is that there is increasingly less funding available for human rights and social justice work. A publication of the Foundations for Peace Network, which is a network of indigenous grantmakers, says that despite some successes in reducing poverty in some places, the new aid architecture has helped to create a global development industry that may not be fit for purpose. But if it is not fit for purpose, do we throw the baby away with the bathwater? Or do we interrogate and deconstruct the structures, systems within the development sector and the language we use to frame the problems that we tackle? One of the thorny questions with which we have to grapple relates to inequality, power disparity, and inequity. I feel that the discourse on and practice of development aid conveniently sidesteps or reframes issues of human rights and inequality, which ultimately diminishes our ability to affect social change. Sometimes the language we use or choose not to use results in problems being hidden rather than brought into focus. For instance, how often do we use the term social justice? We don't, because it's thought to be too activist-like. We used human rights, but even now, human rights is thought to be too incendiary in many contexts. So we moved to the Millennium Development Goals, and now we have the Sustainable Development Goals. We are constantly trying to package and repackage equality, social justice, and human rights in palatable morsels which we think might be acceptable to those in positions of power. However, ignoring systemic problems means we are destined to fail in our attempts. For instance, while the SDGs are laudable and no one could disagree with them, achieving them requires us to tackle the structures and systems that create and contribute to these problems, which brings us right back again to inequality and human rights. There are numerous problems to which economic growth and wealth creation alone will not automatically provide solutions. For instance, gender inequality and sexual and gender-based violence. We have seen that women in even large global companies that are market pioneers or leaders have experienced violence, harassment, and marginalization and have not been particularly successful at times in battling it. Why is this? Because of patriarchy, sexism, and misogyny. Yet often we are afraid to use these words, especially patriarchy. We package sexual and gender-based violence in terms of financial loss incurred by the corporate sector or the businesses to sell it to them and to advocate for internal systems and processes to tackle violence and sexual harassment in the workplace. We don't use the rights language to frame this issue because we are afraid that it would be too controversial or alienating. Foreign aid is also thought to be an integral part of enabling peace and conflict transformation, an assumption which came into being because of the inability or unwillingness of the state to invest resources, particularly financial resources, to support human rights and post-war reconstructions. For decades in many of our countries, civil society has stepped in during crucial periods of conflict and disasters to play the role the state should have, and have done so only because of support through foreign aid. For instance, in Sri Lanka, we have time and time again seen the state invest in vast vanity projects that sometimes adversely affect the population, while seeking foreign aid for post-war rebuilding and reconstruction. It could be argued, like Andrew has, that if foreign aid didn't exist, that the state would step up. But experiential knowledge tells us that where marginalized populations are concerned, sometimes the state has little or no incentives to step up, and lack of external involvement can lead to grave human rights violations. Also, it is undeniable at the same time that development aid impacts deeply divided societies in ways that also exacerbate conflict and deepen existing cleavages. Further, the tendency of donors has been to support high visibility projects with immediate impact. Long-term social change is hence not something that appears to attract their support. For us in Sri Lanka, particularly as a post-war society, the importance of socio-economic empowerment cannot be downplayed. And although aid seems to prioritize development, there is avoidance in tackling the complex issues, such as structural change required to enable economic empowerment, particularly of the marginalized. For instance, let me give you an example. How will a war-affected woman with little education or marketable skills and who has lost her assets and has to fulfill the needs of her 3 children fare in an economic system that ignores existing structural and systemic inequalities and discrimination? In the north and east of Sri Lanka, for example, the end of the war has also meant that the economy has opened up. And we have seen banks and finance companies moving into the north and the east. They target mainly women-headed households and provide loans and microcredit. Women with limited financial literacy and below poverty line incomes mortgage their sparse assets to begin income generation activities that are not profitable, because they do not cater to market needs or gaps, or the women are not connected to distribution or marketing networks. The failure to pay the loan has led to women experiencing severe harassment from loan recovery officers, resulting in even suicides in a couple of cases. Also, when we speak of economic security of those who have lost everything in conflict or war, we cannot deny that we might have to change the rules of the game. That is the way in which the commercial corporate sector functions, if the extremely disadvantaged are to not just survive, but thrive. I do agree that we do need to focus on social entrepreneurship, but wealth creation in a dysfunctional, undemocratic system without a value base that is founded on equality, equity, and non-discrimination is not a panacea to our problems. If a society functions on patronage, has feudal tendencies, and has entrenched hierarchies based on ethnicity, religion, or caste, wealth creation won't necessarily dismantle those structures of inequality, but will only lead to unequal outcomes. Further, many of our communities thrive on patronage, and patronage exists not only within the public sector or between the government and public, it also exists between governments and businesses. In South Asia, recent financial scandals illustrate this nexus, which is maintained through patronage. Hence, I think we also need to interrogate foreign direct investment, which can be positive and enabling, but can also adversely impact human rights, for instance, such as the rights of indigenous people and marginalized groups that might be displaced from their land by large corporations. Hence, aid alone it is not aid alone that fuels corruption or undemocratic governments to survive. Big money also enables and sustains corrupt, undemocratic, and dysfunctional governments. The link between the corporate sector and increasingly ethno-nationalist governments cannot be ignored. High growth rates doesn't mean the end of crony capitalism or patronage or corruption, as South Asia has shown. Listening to the private sector rather than the World Bank or IMF does not necessarily empower economically marginalized or those that are discriminated against. This is where the rights framework becomes important. Of course, it is not possible to bring change only from the outside. Change has to also come from within. But international actors and systems can impact it positively. For example, the generalized system of preferences, which has enabled Sri Lanka to obtain tariff exemptions to export to the European market, has also been used by human rights advocates as a tool to pressure government to bring about certain legislative changes. However, what we have seen now is that these changes have been slow to come. They have been insufficient, which points to lack of national buy-in and ownership of these processes and a lack of political will to undertake reforms. Hence, international involvement doesn't necessarily mean that, there will be automatic change. In countries where local giving in general and giving to social justice and peace-building initiatives in particular is non-existent or is at present at a nascent stage, or where giving consists mainly of charitable initiatives, like we see in Sri Lanka, for instance, where you distribute bicycles and water pumps or rebuild places of religious worship, it is international development actors that have been the main source of funding for work on human rights and social justice. Hence, although government donor agencies have been criticized for using foreign aid as a means of furthering their policy agendas, something that can potentially result in donor-driven programs, their importance as a source of funding for many groups working on human rights and social justice issues cannot be denied. As an Indigenous grant maker and a member of the Foundations for Peace Network, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a network of Indigenous grant makers from around the world, working in an era in which there is an exhaustion of sympathy and a severe deficit of empathy, we, the FFP, much like David taking on Goliath, take on the current development aid sector and demand that each of us acknowledge that we need to change the existing system. We reiterate that there is an urgent need to face head-on issues of inequality and power disparity in international development aid, but not just between the countries that give aid and receive it, but also within the country that receives it, between those disbursing it and the local populations. We believe that encouragement and growth of local philanthropy is imperative to support communities' efforts to gain control of their own development future. If foreign aid is to result in transformation rather than freeze the status quo, it needs to support local mobilization efforts to change attitudes. Time's up, yes. Finally, just to say that a key role for external funders and agencies is to support local efforts to build social justice and peace. And if you'd like to know how Indigenous foundations do this, you can actually come to our sessions tomorrow at 10:45 a.m., which is called Leading from the South. Thank you.